And the other book I think people should look at too is Message from the Ancestors by John Gagnon, and that's available on my website under the Axis Shift section on the news item page. And those three books, in my opinion, give superb evidence of a massive supernova explosion or a similar event. It looks like a supernova explosion way out in our, not in this galaxy, but in the solar system as such, and large amounts of debris flying all over the place. But in the first instance, it's a flash, and then there's a shock wave, and then the debris comes floating in, if you like, many thousands of years later. So the supernova explosion date was put at 39,000 BC. About 7,000 years later, you're getting the shock wave, and then much later, round about this date of 10,700, 10,800, you're getting some of the really large chunks of not just of rock, but close passes by of large objects, clouds of ice, clouds of supercooled nitrogen, all the kind of thing that planets are made of, blasted into our solar system and completely disrupting the passage and orbits of our planets within our own solar system. And the experts would provide you with the evidence of much upheaval there and many clues as to major problems. And at the same time, large chunks of our own atmosphere stripped off, maybe even the atmosphere of Mars completely removed at that time. But that is a little more speculative and needs a lot more research doing on it.
So do you think there's something to the story of, for instance, Tiamat coming in from the Babylonian Sumerian record about the mingling of the salt and the fresh water, that we have potentially some kind of, mixing of ecosystems on this planet, and that the everything on our planet after this point actually is changed in some way. Do you think that was the case?
Well, this is what Bernard Dallaire has done with Derek Allen in their book Cataclysm, which is really the fourth major read for people. They should read that book because it's probably more comprehensive in so many ways, and it does do exactly as you say, refer to Tiamat and Kingu and the Sumerian records, which were interpreted quite differently by Zecharia Sitchin. And Dallaire and Allen, I believe, have made a far better case to show that the Sumerians knew exactly what was happening, and their knowledge of observational astronomy and science was incredible. And here we can follow the trail back to Karsag, or head enclosure as it was called, Garden of Eden. We can look back at very bright, clever people who had managed to survive and were able to bring all the tools and the seeds and the technology to start all over again and to spread that knowledge around the world, and also be incredibly aware of the threats and risk to this planet. And so when we get to the second major problem here, the big problem, at 2354 BC, natural catastrophes and Bronze Age civilizations is the book to get here, and you'll find that that catastrophe arrived. It wasn't as bad as the big one in 10,800, but the people at the time thought it would be another wipeout. So when you see what were in fact the Sumerian kings living in Upper Egypt at the time of the Old Kingdom, you find this massive building program underway with not to bury the dead, but to keep the live people alive. And that's why we find this building of a whole number of constructions, big structures underground, many tunnels, extraordinary mastodons, very sophisticated, and of course something like 80 pyramids built over a time span of 100 years, which coincided with the henges in Britain and dolmens and many other structures which were used for very accurate observational astronomy. They knew a big problem was coming. They took all the measures they could particularly amongst that elite group which had moved from Sumer to Egypt. And in my opinion, there is no doubt that the purpose of the pyramids in Egypt, principal purpose, was for very valuable possessions to be preserved, people to be able to get under cover, the food and the resources there, so that they would have survived several months, if necessary, inside those structures or near those structures. And that was a question of not making the same mistake as they'd made before, which was perhaps not being well enough prepared, which left us literally with a tiny group of people starting all over again.
That's a very interesting idea, and that would mean that there probably, or might be some more shafts or more, temples, if you will, inside the pyramids that we haven't yet discovered then, because as far as I know, there aren't too much space or too much room, but maybe you're just talking about a very small group that was meant to lodge inside the pyramids, right?
Well, I think that you got quite a variation. The Bosnian pyramid has large numbers of tunnels. We don't know what's inside it. There's a suggestion there's much more inside the Great Pyramid. But the Great Pyramid, to me, looks like an engineering marvel to preserve some of the most valuable artifacts of mankind in the worst possible conditions. If we look at many of the other pyramids, we find very large spaces inside where on wooden platforms, etc., an enormous number of people could have taken cover. Even in Mexico with the Pyramid of the Sun, a massive chamber has been found right at the heart of that pyramid, which would have taken an awful lot of people undercover at the time when they expected the problems. And many of the Egyptian pyramids, if one actually looks at them, you find there are a whole number of features there which are interesting, like somewhere to store water at the bottom, somewhere to store food, places for people to go. But they were built to such incredibly high standards. With the Great Pyramid, for example, with this extraordinary hinged door halfway up. If you were going to design a perfect structure to withstand the kind of problems that were thrown at us, 3,354 in some parts of the world, and certainly complete catastrophe with the Earth moving on its axis, then a pyramid structure with the design features and associated rooms, chambers, etc., would have been absolutely ideal for the preservation of life. It's very unlikely these very practical, intelligent people would have built tombs, and we haven't a scrap of evidence that any one of them was built as a tomb. In fact, Snefru, I think, built 3 pyramids, and if you look at the family and the time span of 100 years, this whole spate of pyramid building has nothing to do with tombs whatsoever. It has to do with a practical problem of people who really understood advanced observational astronomy and had survived an earlier catastrophe and really thought it was going to be as bad again, or could be as bad again.
So it's interesting that you bring up the Bosnian pyramids, or what I like to call the Yugoslavian pyramids, from possibly from the older Vinča culture, which seems to have some kind of relationship to other Indo-European cultures at that time. But do you think that they're genuine? There have been some questions about that, but what's your take on it?
Well, I've spent time with Sam Osmanovic and organized lectures for him. I've seen the report on the casing covering being of a very sophisticated form of concrete. I've looked at all the geopolymer research, and it's perfectly clear to me that the ancients understood geopolymers, and they used it in many different ways. They used vegetable acids for finishing off, polishing stonework, etc. And we got evidence of extraordinarily hard and long-lasting concrete on the Rio Tinto River, for example, on the wharves which would have been used for ships to take the metals mined up the Rio Tinto River across the Atlantic or wherever. And so the Bosnian pyramids are a reality, whether you like it or not. We can argue about the date, and we may have more accurate information much later on. But clearly, we have this diffusion of agriculture, sophistication, and peoples from the Canaanites, from the land of Canaan, from the Hittites, the Sumerians, and this movement of the Pelagasi, the Carians, the Lydians, the Etruscans. We can see this whole spread of peoples from the Near East into the northern regions of Hungary, Romania, the Bosnia, etc. And so there's a lot more to discover. We're just scratching the surface of our incredible past, and we need to be open-minded and not have Egyptologists telling us we cannot look for a tunnel, we cannot test equipment, we cannot do anything to upset the status quo of all the knowledge they absolutely certain they know all about.
Yeah, that's right. Absolutely. Totally agree with you. Tell us a little bit more about, you mentioned at the beginning here about the Karsag documents. Tell us a little bit more about these. When were they found, or are they part of some other scripture, or has this mainly been only this document, so to speak, that the Karsag documents is something that been found much in the same way as the Dead Sea Scrolls, or can we compare them in some way to that?
Well, the most important city in Sumeria, from the administrative point of view, was the city called Nippur. And Nippur was dedicated to Enlil and Ninkarsag, two key figures here at Karsag. Many of the cities were dedicated to one god or another. And I would remind everybody listening that even Hadrian, as recently as 146, I think it was, AD, had the Pantheon in Rome rebuilt in honor of these gods. And the Pantheon is an incredible building with a concrete domed roof, where lots of light aggregate material like pumice from volcanoes was used. An incredible design. It's still standing today if you go and look at, and it was dedicated to the gods. And so it wasn't so long ago that we understood that there were real live gods doing wonderful deeds, and they were the culture bearers, they were the real live people, our ancestors, who made everything possible for civilization or the restart of civilization. Now, in Sumer, they wrote history books, and they had incredible records. 90% of their records were extremely accurate, accounting, measuring, practical things which had to be perfect. They also, amongst that material, had a number of important documents. One of them was called the Enuma Elish, for example. The Genesis text is a copy of some of that Enuma Elish material. The Bible's put together from Sumerian records while the Hebrews were in exile. So go back to the original material and look at the Sumerian records. Now, what we had the good fortune of finding were clay tablets in the library at Nippur, which were discovered by the University of Pennsylvania in their expedition 97-98 to Nippur itself, which is about 60 miles southwest of Baghdad. And those tablets were taken back by the University of Pennsylvania team to Pennsylvania Museum and stood in the basement. Now, fortunately, they appeared to have got most of that collection together in one place, because what happened with so many of the tablets from Sumer was they were scattered around to different museums and libraries before they'd even properly catalogued them or even knew what they meant. And they still have this massive problem of translating the cuneiform, the wedge-shaped lines of cuneiform, which changed about 7 times over a 2,000-year period, starting with a simple vertical picture sign, similar to the ones you see on the Phaistos disc. Mm-hmm. And Christian O'Brien took on this task of translating the Karsag epics. And the first man to deal with it was the leading man of his time, Professor George Barton, at the University of Pennsylvania. And Barton thought or regarded these texts as incantations and hymns about Enlil and Ninkarsag. And what, of course, we've been able to do, or O'Brien was able to do, with incredible interdisciplinary skills, was to be able to look again at that work, recognize it as Barton knew that it was the oldest religious text ever recovered, and that it needed to be translated